So in this video, let's talk about the other side of the macroeconomy, that is the supply side, and there we are once again looking at the supply of all goods and services by the producers in the economy. So we are really looking at the aggregate supply, which is also abbreviated as AS. Okay. Now, what is aggregate supply? Aggregate supply is still looking at the supply of all final goods and services in the economy at different price indexes, at different price levels in the economy. So we are really looking at the same relationship, but now we are looking at it from the producer's side, right? So you still have the same two-dimensional diagram where you have real GDP, because we are looking at the supply of all final goods and services, and you still have the price index, that is the GDP deflator, but now you are looking at the relationship between these two from the producer's perspective. Now you know that producers in the economy are really driven by the profit motive. That is what drives them, right? So if the price index is high in an economy, then the producers see higher potential of earning profit, isn't it? So they are going to supply a higher amount of goods and services. So at a higher price index, that supply tends to be higher, so the real GDP would tend to be higher. And at a lower price index, these producers see lower prospect of making profit, so they don't want to produce and sell as much, so the supply will be lower and the real GDP will be lower. So you can see that the supply curve or the aggregate supply curve is going to be upward sloping, and we call this upward sloping curve the AS curve. Now here I want to tell you something. Now this AS curve is really the short run aggregate supply curve. So under the supply side, unlike the demand side, we are creating a divergence, we are differentiating between the short run and the long run. And please note that short run and long run does not refer to any time period. It is not like short run is 6 months and long run is 10 years, or short run is 5 years and long run is 100 years. But short run and long run is kind of differentiated based on adjustment of inputs or adjustment of factors of production, okay? So short run is a time period when all factors of production have not been able to adjust rapidly, and so at least one factor of production is fixed. For example, capital is fixed and only the labor is changing. Whereas long run is the time period when all factors of production being used in the economy have had enough time to adjust, so that everything is variable, everything is changing in the economy. So this upward sloping line that you see, this is really the short run aggregate supply. So we are going to call it the SRAS, or the short run aggregate supply. And we will talk about the short run aggregate supply for a little bit and then move on to the long run side, the long run aggregate supply, and take a look at that after this. Okay. So this is the upward sloping supply curve, is really the short run aggregate supply. Another way of looking at the short run aggregate supply intuitively is the short run aggregate supply is basically the aggregate supply in the current time period. It's the actual aggregate supply of the economy right now. Okay, so that's your short run aggregate supply. What is the aggregate supply of the economy right now? Currently, this is the actual aggregate supply. Now let's quickly talk about the aggregate supply shifters or the short run aggregate supply shifters. So what are the factors that can shift this positively sloped short run aggregate supply? But before that, please remember that anything that's going to increase the short run aggregate supply will cause a right shift. That's still going to be the same thing. And anything that's going to cause a decrease in the short run aggregate supply is going to cause a left shift. Okay, that's going to be true. And any increase in short run aggregate supply or a right shift, that's going to be called a positive supply shock. And and a decrease in the aggregate supply is going to be called a negative supply shock. So that's still going to be similar to the demand side. Okay. Now what are the short run aggregate supply shifters? The first is input prices in the economy. The second is the wages or the wage rate in the economy. Okay. The third is your stock of physical capital for businesses, the capital stock for businesses. And the last one is technology that is used in the country. Technology that is used in the country. So these are the four factors that could cause an increase or decrease in aggregate supply. Please note that as we are talking about the aggregate supply shifters, once again we are assuming that the price index in the economy P is constant. So there is no inflation or deflation happening in the economy. There is no inflation or deflation. The price index is constant, and any change in any of these are going to cause a change in the aggregate supply. Now you can see that wage is also one kind of input price, right? So wage rate is basically the price of labor, where labor is an input, right? So basically you will see the same impact for 1 and 2. If your input price goes up or your wage rate goes up, what you're going to see is an increase in the cost of production. So the aggregate supply is going to come down, isn't it? So for these two, we could say that an increase in wage rate or input price, whichever, if there is an increase, then there is an increase in the cost of production, and as a result of that, the short run aggregate supply will come down, right, and you would see a left shift. And the opposite would also be true. If there was a decrease in wage rate or input price, then the cost of production would be lower and the short run aggregate supply would be higher. So I'm just going to write vice versa. That means the opposite is going to be true if there was a decrease in the wage rate or input price. Okay. Now, do not get confused here. Inflation or deflation basically means the price index rising or the price index falling. Here we are talking about the specific price of certain inputs. For example, let's say power, right? Electricity, that becomes expensive. So electricity is an input that's used widely, right, for most businesses. Now rise in the price of electricity does not mean there is inflation happening in the economy. Please be careful about that. This is referring to the price index of the economy. Whereas this is talking about the price of certain inputs, certain resources that are used for production, where wage rate is also the price of one particular input or resource, an important one, that is labor, right? Now what do we mean by the stock of physical capital? The stock of physical capital means if the business forms in the economy, if the business forms in the nation, they want to increase, suddenly they want to, go all they want to kind of become more capital intensive, they want to become more capital driven. That means, all business firms in the economy start using more machines, right? There is some kind of change in the production process in the country, so that the business firms want to build on their capital stock. That means they try to make their production process more capital intensive, use more machines, use more equipments. That means the business firms are going into large scale investment, and as a result of that increase in capital stock, you will see a higher aggregate supply in the economy. If the capital stock builds, if more machines are used, then obviously production will be higher, right? And if production is higher, then aggregate supply will be higher. Please note that that is not driven by inflation or deflation. So that increase in aggregate supply will be reflected through a right shift of the aggregate supply curve. So anything that's going to take the aggregate supply up is going to shift this aggregate supply curve here to something like SRAS dash, and anything that decreases the aggregate supply is going to take the aggregate supply to the left to something like SRAS double dash. That's still going to be true, right? So if the business firms want to pile on capital stock, if they want to use more machines and equipments, that's going to lead to an increase in production, and that's going to lead to an increase in the aggregate supply. So you would see a right shift of the aggregate supply curve, and the opposite is also true if they want to reduce their capital stock. The same is true for technology. So these two kind of go hand in hand, right? If there is an increase in capital stock or technology, improvement in technology, maybe you know some country, it has imported sophisticated technology from other countries, so there is a technology upgrade, improvement in the whole country, then as a result of that your supply is going to go up, your short run aggregate supply goes up. So we are talking about a right shift, and the opposite will also be true for any degradation of technology or for any depletion of the capital stock. That's also true, vice versa. Okay, so these are the factors that are going to cause a right shift or a left shift of the aggregate supply curve, and those are also known as positive or negative supply shock. Now in the next video I'm going to bring the two sides together, but before that I'm going to talk to you about the long run aggregate supply and how that fits into the macroeconomy.